Okay, so the topic today is the Sixth Trumpet, and if you're familiar with it, that's coming from Revelation. We've talked about the Sixth Trumpet once or twice in the past because it's kind of a major event in what Revelation describes, but not in this detail. Today we're going to look at it in more detail and really dig into the verses and understand what's being said there. And as part of that, I'll help you to understand how you can understand Revelation better for yourself. Now, there are parts of Revelation that are just a challenge and you wouldn't be able to access them. But the Sixth Trumpet is one of those where it's pretty straightforward to make sense of, although there are lots of people who don't. So background to what happens at the Sixth Trumpet of Revelation. Remember that it began with the seven seals, and as each seal was opened, something was happening, and all of those were done through the seventh seal. And then there were the trumpets, the first, second, third, and so on. And beginning with the fifth trumpet, it is called also a woe, one of the three woes. And so things begin to really go bad on the earth when these three woes come about. So the sixth trumpet is also the second woe. And so there's a lot of background I want you to understand about where the world is as the sixth trumpet period begins. And where we are is we're about 3.5 years before Jesus returns. So not very far from the end at all. The world order has been reorganized into 10 groups, 10 kingdoms as they're referred to in Revelation. And so the entire world is ruled by 10 kingdoms, but under these 10 kingdoms, it still seems like there are countries underneath those. So it's not exclusively one country, one kingdom. But we won't go into that in any depth here. So the first and the second beast are in authority. They're running most things, and they are over these kingdoms, over these groups, at least to some extent, completely in some of them. And so the beasts would be easily recognizable by Christians because of what the Bible describes of what they're going to do and things that they're going to cause to happen. And so it should be possible for Christians to easily recognize them, but you just know how Christians work, that there are going to be some of them who are going to dispute this and say, no, these aren't the beasts, these are just somebody else, ordinary people, and there will be people who say those kind of things, and that's just the way it is. At this time, also, the mark of the beast is being distributed and used, and we talked about the mark of the beast previously, and that's also a significant event. That's actually the fifth trumpet. Also, what's happened here in this period is the Jews have been attacked in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was taken over by the beast, and the Jews were captured, or not all of them captured, most of them were captured, some escaped, and the ones who were captured are being relocated to other countries. And because of the mark of the beast is in effect, Christians who don't take that mark are either being murdered or they're being starved to death because they have no access to the economic system. They can't buy or sell anything. So if they can't support themselves in other ways, they're in big trouble. So that's the background to what happens as the sixth seal period begins. Things are tough. So here's the Bible verse beginning the sixth seal, and it says from Revelation 9:13, after these things, the sixth angel sounded, and I heard one voice from the four horns of the altar of gold, which is before God, which said to the sixth angel that had a trumpet, loose the four angels imprisoned at the great river Euphrates. And those four angels were released who were prepared for an hour and for a day and for a month and for a year to kill a third of the children of men. Okay, so this is these three verses are a summary of what's going to be described in more detail coming on after this. And so this is the last major event before Jesus returns, and it's a big one. There are other things that do happen. I'm not sure if I'm going to go into that. Other things that happen in this sixth trumpet period, maybe next week, but maybe not, I don't know. So the thing you have to start with in all of Revelation is asking which of these nouns are literal and which of them are symbolic. Because Revelation is so full of symbolism that you need to sort that out. And so one of the ways you can do that is that you can look at other, hopefully you're familiar with other prophecies and how they have used symbols. And you can say, this symbol that's described here, is it used in other prophecies in symbolic ways? Can I tell from how it's used in other prophecies to understand what it is here? Because there's a consistency in that between the different things that happen in Revelation, and also Daniel is very similar to Revelation in that way. And so that's one of the things we're going to be doing here, is we're going to be asking ourselves, are these things symbolic or are they literal? So it talks about the altar of gold before God, and we know that that's literal. If you remember when God gave Moses the instructions for building the temple, he said, these are the things that are in before God, and I want you to create something on earth that is the same as them. And so this is a literal altar. We know that it has there, but it has a deeper meaning to it, but we're not really going to go into the altar with this study. But the altar is where the voice comes from that tells these angels to begin doing this work that results in 1/3 of the population of Earth being killed. And it talks about the Euphrates. Now, the Euphrates is a literal river, but there's almost certainly a deeper meaning to this. It seems to be, and we'll get into this more as we go along, a location or a cause for this event, because that's where the angels come from. They come from the Euphrates. So is it something that happens on the Euphrates River or something associated with the Euphrates? It's not possible to tell, but we'll look at that as much as we can here. But one thing we can say about the word Euphrates is that it is a Hebrew word, and it comes from an unused root meaning to break forth or to rush forth. And that's probably because the Euphrates was known to go into flood stages where it would overgo its boundaries. And so the word Euphrates basically means going outside of the boundaries. And that is what happens here, is with this day, month, year thing that is talked about. There's kind of an explosion outward, things moving outward that result in the death of 1/3 of the population of the earth. And the reference to children of men, and that's a critical one for us to understand if that's literal or symbolic. And it's literal because it's just not used as a symbol anywhere in the Bible. We see literal references to children of men in other prophecies, and in every one of those it's literal. It isn't symbolizing something else. And so we take that to be literal meaning. Jesus talked about children of men. Other people talked about children of men in other prophecies. And so there's just no other way to see that other than being a literal reference to the children of men. So, and it talks about 1/3 of the children of men. Is that in some way a symbolic thing or a literal thing? In all of the prophecies I know of, the numbers are always literal. They don't have... used this way, I should say it's not that way for numbers like 666. Those are numbers that have meaning associated with them as well as being a number. But in this case, 1/3 and 2/3, which are also used in Revelation, other places, are literal. So when it talks about 1/3 of the children of men being killed, that is literal. There's no reason to believe that it's symbolic. We have every reason to believe that. And so when we look at the current world's population, that would be roughly 2.5 billion people. And if we think it's not that far in the future, it would probably be a similar number. So this is talking about the death of 2.5 billion people. And as it goes on, it's going to describe more detail about this, and we'll get to have a better understanding of what it is that happens that causes their death.
Stan, would it be 2.5 billion people in a certain amount of time, or from the beginning of time or until now?
No, it is, the time reference is in here. When you saw that part where it said a day, a week, a month, a year, that's talking about that, and we're going to go into that right away. So it's talking about something that happens in its totality over a period of a year. But the part of it that starts it is a single day that causes it to happen. We'll dig into that. It's a good question.
I was just going to mention when COVID took over, I was just thinking about that 1/3 of the population.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a huge number. It's an earth-shattering number, is what it is.
That's of the world, though, right? It's not a particular country.
We're going to go into all that. You have great questions, just a little too soon. Yes, we will definitely go into all of that. Okay, so here's the time reference that it's in there. It says these 4 angels are going to go out and do something, and what they're going to do is happen in stages. There's going to be an angel who acts for the first hour, and then who acts for a day, and then one for a month, and one for a year. And so it's going to happen in phases, is what this is saying. And when you look at other big disasters like this, that's the way it works. It's been that way when plagues hit countries. It's been that way with Hiroshima and Nagasaki when they were hit with nuclear weapons. When a big disaster like that happens, people die immediately from the thing that caused it. For Nagasaki, it would have been the nuclear weapon. But it collapses society so much that society can't deal with it. And so they're no longer able to support those people who didn't die immediately. So when the disaster hits, if it's great enough, it collapses society, and the whole medical system can't keep up with it. Remember, they were talking with COVID that the medical system couldn't keep up with too many COVID patients. Well, this is the same kind of situation, though, and magnified. And so what happens is the medical system gets overrun, and it can't handle it. Transportation systems fall apart, and they can't get people to where they need to be. The banking system fails, so you can't buy and sell anything. Food and water become a problem because you can't find either of them. You can't buy food, and you can't find water. And they've talked about that. These big cities that we live in now are sometimes called food deserts because if something bad happens in the city and it crumbles, there is no food you can get. Every city relies on thousands of trucks every day rolling in, bringing in food into the city. And so if you don't have that transportation system going in that keeps on bringing in food, you live in a desert where there is no food.
We're getting that problem with the lack of diesel oil and things like that.
Yes.
Diesel fuel.
Yeah, we see that.
Because they can't really transport it. And knowing, some people I used to know that as truckers, they say a lot of that gas they got to pay for themselves, and they can't do it. You got to pass it on to us. Mm-hmm. And nobody wants to pay that much for food.
Yeah, right now our society is under quite a bit of the same kind of stresses, mm-hmm. but not to this magnitude. This is something even greater. So when that disaster hits, people die immediately from it, and society collapses because so many people have died. And then there's a next day period where the people who had less exposure to that disaster still die. But they weren't killed immediately. Now, Nagasaki and Hiroshima are good examples of that because with them, there were people who immediately died from the weapon going off. But then there were a whole bunch of other people who were polluted or damaged or injured or something like that from that. And those people die over the next day. And then over the next month, people continue to die, but now for a different reason, because they don't have food and water, because society has collapsed. They can't bring in the water. The water systems aren't working or they are polluted. Food isn't coming in. So people start to die from that reason. And then over the next year, people continue to die, but from the whole collapsed society. There are unburied bodies, disease spreading, overpopulation for what the area can now hold, what a city used to be able to hold and service. You can't do that anymore. And so there's a quote here that I have from Wikipedia that talks about the Great Plague of London and the effects that it had. And it said, as time went on, there were too many victims and too few drivers to remove the bodies, which began to be stacked up against the walls of the houses. So people were dying so quickly that there were no drivers to take them out and bury them properly or deal with them, and they just began to stack them up against the walls of houses. And the same situation was happening in Nagasaki and those too. There were so many people who died immediately that it just overwhelmed those kind of services. So in any big disaster, that's just a natural thing, is that there's a progression of people dying. At first they died from the initial disaster, but then they began to die from after effects in stages as things go on. You can live without food and water for a day, but after that it becomes a problem, especially if you're in a stress situation, and you begin to die for those reasons.
Which plague was the one from London?
Good question. It's called the Great Plague, but I don't...
I thought it was a black plague.
I believe it's called cholera.
Cholera? Maybe. I don't remember which is which.
It was called the Black Plague, I believe, and I thought that some of it was because of the rats that were running around,
spreading the disease. Yeah, that definitely was it. So in that case, that was the disease plague. But as we'll look at it here, we'll see for sure that this is not a disease plague kind of situation. Okay, so the cause of the deaths. Now, this goes back to Revelation now, and it begins to talk about how this all happens, this 1/3 of the population of the earth being killed. So it says, and the number of the army of the horsemen was 10,000, which is the Bible's way of saying 200 million. I heard their number, he says. Now, he talks about this army of horsemen. A horseman is a person who rides on a horse in a charging attack in a battle. We don't do it that way anymore, but it was done that way then. And so people who were on the horses had spears and swords and stuff like that, and they would go rushing in and do a charging attack. And that's going to be a parallel here that we're going to be looking at some more. So in an army, this is how a military attack is done, especially in those days, less so now. And it talks about the number of the army of the horsemen. And so we need to make sure we understand that phrase. It doesn't say the number of the horsemen, it says the number of the army of the horsemen. So it's not giving us a count. It isn't saying there are 200 million horsemen. It's saying the strength of the army is 200 million. 200 million, what is the question? And we see numbers being used that way elsewhere in Revelation. We say, or we see in the mark of the beast that I mentioned earlier, it says the number of the name of the beast is 666. So it's the same sort of thing. It doesn't mean that 666 is the count of something or the number of something. It's saying that it's a number that you associate with the name. And for the beast, it says there is a way that you can calculate the name of the beast, or you will be able to at that time, to figure out this 666 and how it applies to the beast. And so 666 is a number that represents the name of the beast. And in the same way here, this 200 million somehow represents this army of horsemen, and it wouldn't be the count of the horsemen. It's more of a representation of the strength of the army or the strength of this attack. And we'll get into more on that later on about how we can interpret that in a way that makes sense. Yeah.
I looked it up, and it says the plague was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which is usually transmitted through the bite of a human flea or louse.
Oh, okay. That one through fleas. Yeah.
It says Great Plague of London.
Okay. Yeah, because there were more than one plague. There were plagues that traveled through Europe many times and had different causes. So that one was fleas and lice. Okay, so the next verse describing how this great disaster comes about is this Revelation 9:17. And it says, "And in this way I saw the horses in a vision, and those sitting upon them had breastplates of fire and chalcedony brimstone, and the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and fire and brimstone and smoke proceeded from their mouths." So now obviously we're talking about things that are symbolic here. We can see a lot more symbolic discussion where we didn't see that before. And when we think about it, horses, are horses symbolic or literal? Well, horses are used in Revelation and other places and other prophecies as well. And in all of those prophecies, they're symbolic of something. They're symbolic of the idea of something that travels quickly. And because the horse was the fastest thing they had, the fastest way to move was on a horse. And so horses represented the ability to go fast or the ability to travel great distances in a short time. And so when you see horses in prophecy, that's what they're talking about. And when you remember, there's another section of Revelation talks about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That is, those horses there again are representing something that travels quickly across the face of the earth. And so horses here are definitely symbolic, and they're telling us something. And if it wasn't obvious enough, horses don't have heads of lions, and so we could easily see that it was symbolic just from that reference. And those heads don't have fire and brimstone and smoke coming out of their mouths. So it also talks about a breastplate, and this breastplate is going to be important to us, and I'm going to dig into that in just a moment on the next slide. It says that those people who are controlling the horses have this breastplate or this symbol, and it talks about the symbol being fire and chalcedony brimstone, which would be fire. We know chalcedony brimstone is less clear. It appears to be an agate or a jasper made out of sulfur. Brimstone is sulfur, and we'll see more of that reference as we go along. And so this breastplate, as we'll see in just a moment here, has a symbol or is a symbol of what this army is or some characteristic about them. And God quite often does that. He will give us hints about who these people are. But in many cases, we don't have enough information at this time to know who these people are. And so it may be telling us something about the attitude or the character of the people who are sending forth these horses. And it might be an attitude like we solve problems with nukes, and we're going to see nukes coming up again. So at that time, these words will have more meaning, but now we can only get a kind of a general idea that there's something about this breastplate that indicates the character of the people who are sending forth these horses. Now the breastplate, I wanted to go more into that, and here's where we are. This is a commercial replica you can buy of a Roman centurion breastplate. So just like we do in modern times, our forces have symbols that they wear on their clothing. This Roman centurion breastplate would cover him from about neck down to waist, or a little lower than waist. And you can see on it there are symbols on it, and these would be the symbols of his unit that he was associated with. They were just like we have the 506th Artillery and things like that nowadays. This would symbolize the group that he was part of. And so these breastplates, especially with the Romans and even earlier than that, so this Roman centurion has a breastplate that identifies who he is and sort of the character of the group that he's associated with. And the Revelation, as you remember, was given to John during Roman times, so they were familiar with breastplates that had insignia on them or signs on them that indicated the attachment that this person had to the organization. And so the basic breastplate was, yes, it was there for vital organ protection, but they took the opportunity to put insignia on it to mark it as being what unit you were with in the military. And so it was quite common then, not for the common soldier so much, but certainly for a person like a centurion. He would have a marking on his breastplate that indicated what his group was that he was with. And so the horseman's breastplate is also showing something like that, the character or who they're with or something like that. But at this time, we just don't have enough information to make sense out of that part. But that's why you're seeing the breastplate being described there, as God is telling us something that we can't yet understand about these people. So that's one we just kind of keep in the back of our head. Now, I mentioned brimstone. Brimstone is sulfur. That's kind of the Bible's word for sulfur. But more than that, it means something. It metaphorically, it means a burning rock that destroys. And brimstone is used in lots of places in the Bible. I don't know if you've ever used sulfur or burned sulfur. If you were a delinquent like myself, as a young boy, I did that. And sulfur is very interesting. It comes as a yellow rock, but you can take a match and hold it up to that yellow rock and it will start to burn. And once it starts to burn, it is dangerous because it's putting off noxious fumes and it really smells bad. And also it won't stop burning. The silly thing is really difficult to get it to stop. If you put a stick against it, some of the sulfur will melt off and come on the stick and start the stick on fire. And if you touch it, you're going to get a bad burn for sure. And because it kind of liquefies part of that rock as it burns, there's this burning liquid sulfur that's always associated with it, and it's a danger if you touch it to anything.
Is that the one like in science class that smell like rotten eggs?
Probably, yeah. It's been so long since I smelled that smell, I don't remember, but
Sulfur.
H2S is, yeah, it would be similar, yeah. And yes, and it's really noxious. As soon as you smell that, you say, "Oh, I don't want to smell that anymore." So yes, that is what brimstone in the Bible is. It's sulfur, but it really has in all the Bible more meaning than that. The Bible refers to Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed by brimstone. And in the site that they believe Sodom and Gomorrah existed now, they find these glassified sulfur balls, sometimes just little small pea-sized ones. Some of them are bigger, like a big fat marble. And they are sulfur that has kind of glassified on the outside of it. So that's the Sodom and Gomorrah reference. The Bible also talks about the future lake of fire where all the unbelievers will be thrown, and it's described as being fire and brimstone as well. And there are other places where you see brimstone being used to infer or symbolize destruction. And that's what burning sulfur does if you aren't careful with it. Burning sulfur just keeps on burning until it's done burning, and it's very hard to put out. And we also saw mentioned there this lion's head on the horse. Because the horse is symbolic, we know that the lion's head is also symbolic, but that was kind of obvious because horses don't have lion heads. And so lion heads are used very commonly in prophecy symbolically, and they represent fierceness or danger in the same way that you would think of a lion if you saw a lion, even at the zoo, too close to you, you're kind of in awe of the force and the power that he represents, because they are very strong, dangerous animals if they're not separated from you. So the lion's head is representing that fierceness and danger, and that's a common thing in prophecy. And it says this lion head produces three things. It produces fire and brimstone and smoke. And so now we understood fire and smoke before. Brimstone we now understand too. And we'll dig into this some more because the verses repeat this idea. Okay, it continues to describe these horses. And it says, by these three scourges, now that's an important thing, we're going to dig into scourges as well. A third of the children of men were killed by the fire, by the brimstone, and by the smoke that proceeded from their mouths, the mouths of the horses, because the power of the horses was in their mouths and also in their tails. This is the first time tails are mentioned. But we know that tails are going to be symbolic because everything in this horse is symbolic. So each of these is a scourge, which is a whip. That's the Bible word for a whip. And so the first thing we would think is who is doing the scourging and who is being scourged by this. And you might think, well, surely these third of the children that are dying are the ones being scourged. But that isn't going to be the case. You might be a little surprised when you realize who's doing it and who is being scourged. And so think about that. We'll get to that. So and it says the power of the horses is in their mouths, and it talks about the fire and the brimstone and the smoke that comes from their mouths. And it talks about their tails, and the tails are also symbolic. So the horses and the heads are all symbolic. And this tails is a new thing, and we're going to also see that and make some sense of that as we go along here. So the verses continue on, Revelation 9 still, and it says, and the rest of the children of men who were not killed by the scourges did not turn from the work of their hands to not worship devils and idols of gold, of silver, and of brass, and of wood, and of stone, which do not see, neither hear, nor are able to walk. And they did not turn from their murders, or from their witchcraft, or from their fornication. Okay, important stuff there. God is behind this. God is the one who is causing this. Certainly men are the ones who are sending these horses to cause the destruction, but God is causing or allowing this to happen for a purpose. And he's doing that because he's using it as a scourge. And so, as I said, a scourge is the same thing as a whip. And so he's using this whip to, if you understand it this way, whip some sense into these people. You've heard that expression, is that sometimes people are just so clueless that the end of a whip is the only way you can get them to figure things out and to start thinking about it. And so the people who are actually being whipped here are not the people who are killed. It's the people who are living. And God is using this mass death to show the people your evil ways. Look at your evil ways and how you've come to this. You've destroyed 1/3 of the population of the earth. Don't you see how evil you are? But they don't. They don't see that, and they continue on doing what they're doing. We have a parallel to that. If you remember when the Twin Towers were knocked down, right away people charged into the churches, and that lasted for about a month, and then they charged back out of the churches and were gone. And so at a time like that, people tend to turn toward God, and that's what God's intent is, for them to see that this is God in action and how evil they are. But the lasting effect of that with the Twin Towers was very short. It was like a month, and I remember hearing the stories of how churches started baptizing people more than they could handle, of people who came running to the churches to be baptized. And it wasn't long until the church population had gone back to where it was. But that is God's purpose here. And he is the one behind all of this, making sure he's showing people how evil that they are in the hopes that they would turn back to him. So now we've been through all the verses, we can start to put some pieces together here. In our time, the only thing that can cause 2.5 million people to die is a nuclear weapon that fits this description in any way. We do have chemical weapons. We also have biological weapons. We've seen with COVID that a biological infection like that can have some effect, but it's really hard to control that. If China was the one who released that, then it's come back on China as bad as anybody. So those kind of weapons just aren't the same. Plus, it talks about this horse and the fire and brimstone and smoke coming from that. And biological weapons just aren't that. In fact, biological weapons are destroyed by fire and things like that. So the only thing that really matches what the Bible says that can kill 2.5 million people, 1/3 of mankind, is a nuclear weapon, or a bunch of nuclear weapons, in fact, because it's really hard to do that. So, so we have this common sense notion. The only way you can kill that many people is through nuclear weapons. And so what we want to do, and this is a necessary thing whenever you're studying prophecy and you think you have an understanding for it, is to see, does this fit with everything that we just read? Everything should match up in some way and make sense in some way if we start with this idea that this is talking about nuclear weapons. And so can we do that here and make senses of it? So if we're talking about nuclear weapons being the things that cause this devastation, then the horses would be the missiles. And that makes sense because the horses are the representation of something that flies quickly or travels quickly in a great distance in a short time. And so that makes sense that way. And it talked about the head of the horses bringing fire and brimstone and smoke. Well, the nuclear warhead definitely brings that. There's that fire, a bright light as it goes off, burning uranium, which is burning rock. Burning plutonium is the source of all of it. And smoke, it causes radioactive clouds of debris in the sky, so that certainly matches up with smoke. So so far it makes quite a bit of sense here that this would be nuclear weapons traveling as missiles and landing and destroying people. And it talked also about the power of the horse being in its head, yes, but also in its tail. And we know that that's how rockets work. The tail is what gives it the power to make this great speed and travel this great distance in a short time. And so we have a pretty good match there that makes this seem like it's most likely nuclear weapon missiles that are being fired and exchanged here. It talks about the breastplate of the army of horsemen. And that one is still going to be one that we just don't have a good understanding of. And I think that's just because the time isn't near enough that we can make sense of that. And so we know that it makes sense that it would be talking about their character, but the time just isn't close enough that we can make sense. Okay, and it talked about the 200 million. How does that make sense in any way? And it does make sense. Remember, it was talking about the army or the strength of the army. This army attacking its strength would be measured in megatons. That's how we measure nuclear weapon power, is in megatons. And so it would be talking about 200 megatons of nuclear power being the strength of these armies. And so it makes sense that way too. But this is important to understand. Nagasaki was destroyed by a weapon that was 0.015 megatons, a very small, trivial explosion in comparison. Hiroshima was 0.025 megatons, so still trifling amounts if they wiped out those cities. So a megaton is a significant amount of power. So now we have kind of an understanding of what's happened. The only way to make sense of it is to make sense of it as nuclear missiles being fired back and forth. And so now we can think about that a little bit more in terms of what countries would be involved, who would be involved in this. Now we need to keep in mind that we're now in that 10-kingdom world, and the earth has been reorganized into 10 kingdoms. But as I said also before, these 10 kingdoms still seem to be seeing themselves as separate countries within the kingdoms they're in. So right now there's 193 countries in the UN, and they will be reorganized into 10 kingdoms. And we don't know exactly how that'll happen, but we know that it will happen. And so that may affect things. When we say China or India in this discussion here, maybe China and India aren't the same as they used to be. So we're really talking more about population densities as we know them right now when we talk about those countries. But the actual countries may be different at that time. The first thing we know from the Bible and other prophecy is that Israel won't be affected by this. And we know that because physical Israel and the Euphrates River have big parts to play still. That their role isn't done. So they can't be radioactive ground in order to play that part. Jerusalem is still very involved. Other things in Israel are very involved. So we know that it wouldn't involve Israel. That's pretty clear. So who does it involve? And when you think about it, it's actually very difficult to kill 2.5 billion people. That's a huge, huge number of people. How do you do that? And the Earth is such a big place, and being a huge Earth, we think of nukes as being grand, but on the scale of the Earth, they're really minor things. They're just little tiny black dots where they've exploded and nothing of significance to the Earth. And so a nuke might be able to wipe out a city, but to wipe out 2.5 billion people, that's really a challenge. And so we also can see something here in that when you kill off 2.5 billion people, this isn't tactical use of nuclear weapons like a military would normally use. This is an attempt at genocide to make people completely disappear. You're at this point when you do that, you're trying to wipe out an entire country, all of the people in it. So it's not the way weapons would normally be used. So looking at the populations of our countries, and remember I said that countries might be a little different in that time. The three most populous countries are the USA in third place at 0.33 billion people, India in second place at 1.4 billion, and China in first place with 1.4 billion. India, that's this rounding error you're seeing there. India is slightly below 1.4 and China is slightly above, but they're so close that it really doesn't matter. And after the USA, which is not even comparable in size by population, comes a whole bunch of other countries, and finally you get down to number 9, which is Russia at 0.15 billion. So the very first thing you can see there is the only way to get 2.5 billion people killed is that you need to wipe out pretty much India and China. And so it makes sense that India and China have to be involved in this. You can't get that many people dead without involving them, because they're spread out too much on the Earth. If Russia and the US got into a nuclear war, the most it would kill is 0.48 billion people if they managed to wipe out each other completely. And so, of course, that'd be a disaster here, but you're nowhere near 2.5 billion people. And so it's kind of important to understand that here, that there isn't a way to get to 2.5 billion people killed without having both India and China involved in it. But the interesting thing is that India and China actually have small numbers of nukes right now. Both of them hide their figures for what they have for nuclear weapons. But there are people who make estimates of these things, and they think that India has 156 nukes and China has 350. And both of those are known to have refined plutonium and uranium that they could make more nukes pretty quickly if they wanted to. But as first strike, that's what they would have.
So that 2.5 billion people, you think that's just one strike or a combination of?
Well, what we can say that makes sense is India and China have to be involved, because you can't get that many dead people without them. And we'll go into that some more here. And so if they are involved, though, you can get 2.5 billion out of their numbers without any trouble. So it could be just India and China alone. And that would make a certain amount of sense in a map that we're going to see here in a moment here. So it may just be India and China and nothing else. And to be honest, India and China have had problems in the past. They're right next door to each other, and they've disagreed on many things in the past. So it's not unreasonable to think that that could happen again.
But do you think it's like just one huge strike, or since the beginning of time until now, it would be 2.5 billion?
No. From when this strike happens, remember it said the hour, the day, the week, the month, the year. That hour would be the strike, and so we're talking about a nuclear weapon exchange. One side fires, the other one sees them incoming. They fire back, they cross, land on each other, and kablooey! Both of them are shattered. And then people begin to die in stages over months and years from that. So, so there isn't a scenario that can't involve India and China because they're heavy populations. You need to have a population density that is quite high in order to get that death rate. And only India and China have that. So it has to involve them. Does it involve others? We don't know. It may not. It could just be those two fighting. They have small numbers of nukes, but modern nukes can each be a megaton without any problem. So you could easily get to the number that we saw there, the 200 megatons of nuclear weapons, without any challenge from just the nukes that they do have. So it's also quite possible that it's just them from that case. Now here's an interesting map. As I was preparing this, YouTube popped up a video for me that talked about this. if you were to draw a circle on the map or the globe of the Earth, and you wanted to draw the smallest circle you could draw that would include half the population of the Earth, this is that circle. And so let me get my pointer out here. I'm going to need that. Okay, so this is, if you recognize it, this is China through here. This is India through here. And so there's your two most populous countries sitting right there in this smallest circle that contain half the Earth's population.
With the black one?
This green circle here. See the green circle?
But I was talking about the black circle.
Oh, yeah, that's just the center point of it. That's a small city of no meaning, nothing special about it. It just happens to be at the center of this circle.
So the green?
So the green contains 1/2 the population of the Earth.
Wow.
Yeah, that's population density. And that's what you need in order to kill that many people. You need to strike a high density population area. And so you can see that Russia up here isn't involved in that. Their population is widespread over a large area, so they just don't have the population density you would need to cause this disaster. And so what we have here is China up here, and over here India, and down here we have Indonesia, other places like that are also very high population zones, but they aren't militaries, they aren't nuclear powers, so they don't have any weapons like that themselves. So they really just happen to be in this half the population of the Earth group, I think. And so again, we come back to that idea that the only way you can kill that many people is it has to involve India and China. The population density isn't high enough anyplace else on the Earth to do that. Okay, so we've fitted everything together based on the idea that this is a nuclear weapon, a missile being fired back and forth. And that all made sense, but there were some unfitted points, and it's only fair to bring up those things. Whenever you're trying to interpret prophecy and you think you have an understanding of it, as I said before, you need to apply that to everything the Bible says about that to make sure that it fits. And if there are places that don't fit, then you need to think about those things to make sure that they aren't telling you something that your idea is wrong about the interpretation of this prophecy. And so I'm doing that here. These are pieces that we don't have explanations for, or at least not solid ones. It talks about the horns of the altar. That's where the voice came from that set the angels off on this destruction path. But we don't care so much about that. That's just the start of it. In this, we're really much more interested in what happens. So we don't fully understand that. We don't fully understand the Euphrates and the angels who are tied up there, how exactly that makes sense. We'll talk about that some more too. We also talked about the breastplate and that it would be an insignia indicating some sort of characteristic about these people. We don't have a full understanding of that one either, and so we don't have anything that matches up with those little pieces. But those seem to be pretty small pieces, and we have a good understanding of whatever else is in there, and it makes sense from a lot of reasons. So some things in the future may be being described there, and we just don't know them yet because they're not close enough in time. Remember that it's only close enough in time now for us to come up with this nuclear scenario. In the past, before nuclear weapons came about, people would read this passage and there was no way you could imagine that 1/3 of the Earth could ever be destroyed in a strike because there just wasn't any capability like that. So now here we are in this time, things have progressed enough that we can see, yes, it is actually possible to destroy 1/3 of the Earth's population. And we have the technology now to do that. And so the same scenario or the same thing may be true, that some of these things we just don't understand now because the time isn't available yet where we have the information that makes it possible to understand those. Okay, now, and the reference to the Euphrates is one that is interesting. That's telling us something about the source or the location or the cause of this attack. And that much is certain, but that doesn't tell us much. There's a Duke Ferdinand moment, if you've heard of that phrase. Duke Ferdinand was some duke of something back before World War I. And before World War I broke out, there were a lot of people who had set up alliances and were scrapping in small ways and angry with each other. And so there was kind of a lot of tumult, but they hadn't gotten into a big battle yet at that time. And then somebody went and assassinated this Duke Ferdinand, and that triggered everything. Because of his death, and because of alliances that had been set up with his people, everybody went into war mode, and World War I began. So with the assassination of one person, that World War I came about. And so something like that may happen here. It may be that there's some assassination or something like that that happens along the Euphrates River. Maybe that's what causes this attack to happen in that same sort of Duke Ferdinand way. But it also could be that this reference to the Euphrates is talking about a peace meeting that's at the Euphrates River, or maybe it's at the Euphrates building or something like that, someplace like that that is associated with that Euphrates name. And so it's telling us something about that. And again, this is something we won't know until we're closer to that situation and can understand it better. But it definitely indicates that the source comes from some reference to Euphrates. And we talked about the breastplate, telling us something about the character of the people who fire off these missiles, but we don't care so much about that one. Okay, imagery. I want to talk about this because so many people make this mistake. You see it everywhere on the web, is that people try to interpret prophecy by drawing pictures. And so when prophecy talks about this 10-headed beast with 3 heads that have been cut off and all that sort of stuff, people like to draw pictures of that as though the picture would give them some help. And here we see an example of a person who's tried to draw a picture of this. So he's drawing a man riding a horse. The horse is breathing this fire and all the other things that we have, and it has that tail. The person thinks that this is some way to look at it and understand the prophecy from that. But prophecy is never like that. There's no value in drawing these things. These are all symbolic things, and you need to understand the symbolism that's being shown there. And so we talked about what the head means symbolically. We talked about what fire and brimstone are, those sorts of things. And we talked about the breastplate. We spent a lot of time on the breastplate. So we understand these things as symbolic descriptions that we need to understand the symbols, and drawing a picture like this adds no value at all. In fact, what it tries to do is it tries to interpret everything as literal, as though this was a real horse that really breathed fire from its really lion head. And that's just not the case. These are all symbolic things that are symbolic descriptions of other things. So drawing a picture just makes it worse.
What is at the tail end?
Well,
It looks like a snake.
it is a snake head, but I'm not going to go into why that's there. It's actually a translation problem. We'll just, skip that. You didn't see that in the verses that I showed you, because in that translation, the snake head isn't there. So the artist really, by making this picture, is just propagating his own confusion about things and not helping anything. And so the error is that he shows a man literally sitting on a literal horse with literal head, and all of those things are symbolic. And we know that nuclear weapons, there isn't a man riding on a nuclear weapon. We know that they're controlled from the ground. And so they're controlled in a different way. And it views the horse's mouth as though it's kind of like a dragon's mouth where he's spitting fire and stuff like that. And it views the breastplate as a real garment. But God uses breastplates and things like that to indicate character of the people that are wearing them. And so what's really intended is something that looks an awful lot more like this. That's a cruise missile that could be nuclear powered. And it fits. It has the power comes from the tail, which has the engine in it, and from the weapon in the nose of it. And that's where its power comes from. That's where its destruction comes from. And so all of that makes more sense as something that is symbolically described that couldn't have been described in their time. How could you explain jet engines and nuclear weapons way back in Roman times? Well, you couldn't. And God doesn't even try to do that. So using these drawn images that people have created trying to represent what the Bible says isn't a useful practice at all, but I see it a lot. So keys to understanding and keys to success in understanding prophecy. Always important to have a very direct translation. Because the translators are humans, they're just as confused as those artists who drew those pictures. And so if you give them the leeway to translate the Bible in whatever way they want, they can take it astray, and you get these snake heads on the tails. And so translators can easily make mistakes when they translate prophecy. So you want a direct translation to work from. And as we did, determine which nouns are symbolic. That isn't always as easy as it seems, but a horse with a lion's head, that's symbolic. That's pretty easy. And so I chose this passage here because it is pretty easy to understand which things are symbolic and which are literal.
And I don't think that I don't think they're trying to be evasive or confusing in the Revelations, because I think what's happening is, here are people like John, for example, they see something and they only interpret it in terms of what they know, of what they understand. So if they've never seen a helicopter, for example, or a jet, they would say, well, it had the sound of chariots and the whole bit, and like people, what did he just say what it is? Well, he doesn't know what it is.
No. He has no way to understand that at all. No background. We are that far away in technology that he doesn't have a reference like that. Yeah, and that's certainly part of it. God chooses to represent things symbolically. And we see that in Ezekiel as well. He talks about things just because people can't, the people of that time had no way to understand what was being described. But also because God likes to hide things, and he likes to have his people search those things out. And that's part of how God's nature just is. And so, once you've kind of figured out which nouns are symbolic references like that and which ones are literal references, that gives you a good start in understanding what's going on. And so that's the nouns. When you look at verbs, the verbs, we saw the man sitting on the horse. Well, sitting on the horse doesn't necessarily mean sitting. It means controlling, because that's what a man who sits on a horse does. He controls the horse. And so he doesn't sit there just to sit. So we understand that as being a description symbolically of someone who controls, and not necessarily someone who sits on the device that is being described symbolically. And so some parts of Revelation, as I said earlier, right at the start of this, has a whole heavy symbolism over it. And you can really see that when he talks about beasts and heads and horns and stuff, those are very difficult to figure out, to understand. And some of them just can't be understood yet. The time isn't ready for them. But there are definitely other passages like the one that we just went through where it is possible to understand it. The symbolism is pretty light and pretty straightforward and not that difficult to figure out. And as we're talking about the nature of God here, from Deuteronomy 29:29, it says, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever." So there we see the idea that God holds some things back and keeps some things secret, but there are other things that he reveals to his children. And it's possible to understand what he has revealed at the time that he is ready for it to be understood. Any questions?
So we're to know part of it and not everything, because some things are purposely hidden.
Yeah.
Because that's God's purpose for us to not know everything.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree with what you said, that God expects us to study and to really think about these things. It isn't supposed to be easy at all. It's kind of like Jesus would say, "Unto you, it is given to know the kingdom, the words of the kingdom of the Lord, and unto others is given in parables."
Right.
But it's not because he doesn't want them to know; it's just that he wants them to work for the knowledge of getting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't think they want to.
They didn't.
And I don't think that a lot of preachers today want people to get too complex in their messages. Like something like this would not go over well with some churches. They went too hard. Let's go back to the breastplate and all of the different things about putting on the salvation and all of that, and the armor and the whole thing. We want to keep it as basic as possible, but it's like they're trying to keep feeding them baby food.
Right. Exactly.
So they can't grow.
Yeah. And all of that scripture was given to us for some reason.
Yeah.
And you're throwing it away if you're saying, well, that's just too complicated to teach, so I won't teach it. You're cheating the people.